tu José Ignacio Torrenta. Good morning. No, no estoy de intérprete. No estoy de intérprete. ¿Estás tú de intérprete?
No, doctor. Ready to go, so
Decirme cuando esté preparado para que podamos empezar. Ahora sí que estamos funcionando. Si alguien me está escuchando, que levante la mano, por favor. Sí, ahora sí. Vale. Bueno, pues adelante, por favor.
Ya puedes, Nacho.
De acuerdo, vamos a hacer ahora la prueba. Me dicen que los traductores ya están conectados. Buenos días, Iván, Sergei, Andrei, ¿escucháis la traducción? ¿Estamos bien? En este momento podemos contar con...
running now. Can we start? Can you hear the translation?
Alguien tiene que
Muy bien.
Alguien tiene que explicarles cómo funciona la configuración de Zoom. El audio nos llega bien, pero tienen que conectarse los invitados a través de su pantalla de Zoom. Ellos tienen que elegir el canal de inglés para que pueda recibir la traducción. No, ellos tienen que elegir el canal de inglés en su pantalla de Zoom para que puedan oír la traducción. Alguien les tiene que dar las indicaciones para que se conecten con la interpretación a través de Zoom con el idioma correspondiente, que en este caso sería el inglés. Y nosotros no podemos hacer más desde la cabina.
Hello, can you hear me now, sir? There is a channel. Hello, there is a channel, and I'm speaking in English now, and hello there, can you hear me? This is the interpreter speaking on the English channel. Hello, can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? Hello? Hello, can you hear me? Hello, this is the interpreter speaking. Could somebody please react to my comments? You have to... Do I have to give them any instructions for the channels? Do I have to switch off English or Spanish, or it has to be English? You have to tell them to select English.
Nacho, ¿puedes hablar en castellano, por favor? Para ver si llega la traducción en inglés.
Queridos ponentes, en el Zoom tenéis al lado de levantar la mano un globo.
Yes, now it works.
Versiones. Ok, Sergei, ahora me escucha bien. Sergei is listening to me. Iván, is the translation working for you? La traducción funciona para Iván. Andrei, la traducción funciona para Andrei.
Estupendo, pues adelante entonces.
Muy bien, pues muchísimas gracias. Una vez sorteadas las dificultades técnicas, vamos a comenzar con este panel que se llama La Unión Europea y Rusia, percepciones y cómo traducimos misperceptions todavía, ¿no? y problemas de percepciones en la relación. Quiero dar las gracias, por supuesto, a todos los que nos siguen y y a los organizadores, a la Comisión Europea y al alto representante por seguirnos y muy especialmente a nuestros ponentes por estar aquí hoy con nosotros. Voy a introducirlos brevemente para que podamos comenzar la sesión. Tenemos con nosotros a Andrei Kortunov, que es director general del Consejo Ruso de Relaciones Internacionales y que se graduó en el Instituto de Relaciones Internacionales de Moscú y completó sus estudios en Estados Unidos y Canadá, y que es doctor en Historia. Recomiendo a los alumnos que nos siguen hoy que lean una pieza de Andrei Kortunov de febrero del 16, donde, cito literalmente, dice: lo último que la Unión Europea debería hacer es renunciar a sus ventajas comparativas e intentar jugar a ser una gran potencia en los términos de otros en su propio territorio. Es un artículo que está publicado en New Global Strategy Expert Opinion y concluye diciendo, cuando habla de la Unión Europea como un enano geopolítico, dice: todas las personas que hayan seguido El Señor de los Anillos saben que los enanos no son los peores animales de la Tierra Media y tienen alguna oportunidad de convertirse en sabios en algún momento. Os recomiendo esta pieza de Andrei Kortunov, que me parece muy provocadora y muy interesante y nos dará para la discusión a continuación. Tenemos también con nosotros a Sergei Guriev, que es el director de los programas de máster y doctorado en economía de Sciences Po, y también ha sido director de investigación del Banco Europeo de Desarrollo y Reconstrucción. Del doctor Guriev creo que es interesantísimo todo su trabajo.
He's very interesting, his work, and the first work we got to know on the work of the oligarchy and of the Russian capital. It is very interesting. Very few individuals have addressed the corruption, capitalism, as well as his numerous articles, recent articles he has published on the state of Russia, Belarus 2020, and different articles I recommend to the students. Also, he works on disinformation and post-truth with different experimentations in France related to the Yellow Jacket manifestation. We also have Ivan Krastev. It is a great pleasure to have him here. He works for the Center for Liberal Strategy of Sofia, a member of the Executive and Foreign Relations of the European Council. I strongly advise one of his publications, Europe After Europe, as well the light that dims off. And also he has an article, very interesting, in the New York Times, which is entitled, "Why Are American Liberals So Afraid of Russia?" And in this idea of perceptions, we established a different parallelism and are the similarities of the States and Russia in their attitudes, their approaches towards democracy and the populism, and also its vision of the foreign intervention in the world. So thank you very much, Ivan, for being here with us. We also have, of course, Carmen Claudín. It is a great pleasure to share panels with her. Carmen Claudín is a researcher, associate fellow researcher, senior researcher, sorry. She's a historian and a researcher for Russian topics, and we always learn a lot. And I strongly advise to the students last article of the Pais, which is called Navalny, the great question of the Putin regime, and it talks about the current situation in Russia. So, dear friends and students, you have a lot of articles to read, but we will first of all start with this discussion. We will have three different parts. First, the speakers will have to answer one question, and then we will have a short discussion among them, and then last but not least, we will open the floor to the students of the university and the guests. So with no further ado, we will start this panel. Thank you very much. I will start with Andrei Kortunov. Good. Buenos días, es un placer tenerla aquí entre nosotros. Por favor, voy a empezar por una.
Short but very complex. It is a question about what does Russia think and what does Russia want these days. Thank you so much, Mr. Kortunov. Okay, please unmute your mic.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Torreblanca.
Han cancelado.
Let me say that I'm really very glad that I'm a part of this very distinguished panel. And although the time is limited, but let me start with sharing some of my general views on what we can expect from Russia in terms of its perceptions. Let me try to fix the language because I still have the sound getting back to me. But now it seems to be fine. So first of all, let me start with saying that, of course, Russia is a big country. And there is no consensus among Russians about its role in the world, about its relations with the East and in the West. Views of particular Russian citizens depend on their political affiliations, but also on the education they got, on their professional backgrounds, and even on their geographical locations. Of course, people in Kaliningrad are quite different from those who dwell on foreign policy in Vladivostok. So let me limit myself to just a couple of ideas about the Russian leadership, how it sees what Russia needs, what Russia wants, and what role Russia has to play in Europe and beyond Europe. And I think that we will not understand the Russian leadership logic if we do not dig into the mindsets of people who run the place today. And if I were to limit myself to just one sentence, I would say that the people who lead the country today regard the outside world more as a challenge rather than as an opportunity. For them, the world has entered a protracted period of instability, volatility, multiple crises, arms race, protectionism, deglobalization, and so on and so forth. So it's a pretty gloomy place. And some even argue that the risks of a major war in Europe are real and keep growing. If you assume that the outside world is a challenge rather than an opportunity, I think that you should probably consider your goal as to prepare your country for living in this primarily hostile and adversarial environment. It means that the name of the game is not really prosperity, it's more survival. It's not about economic and social development, but rather in providing security. And I think that the perception in the Kremlin, to the extent I can judge about perceptions in the Kremlin, is that we should make sure that Russia is better prepared to face this challenge than other countries with which Russia has to deal in the international arena. We should use our comparative advantages, even if we have to pay a higher price for this preparedness. I think Putin is very clear about the red lines. The red lines in dealing with the West and in dealing with the European Union in particular is, of course, the so-called non-interference into the Russian domestic affairs. And this non-interference is interpreted in a rather loose way. It implies not just attempts at regime change in Russia proper or in countries close to Russia, but it also includes various activities of Western NGOs, foundations, media outlets, and even universities that are accused of attempts to interfere into Russian domestic affairs. So this preoccupation with sovereignty, the way it is understood in the Kremlin, this preoccupation with non-interference explains, for example, the poor outcome of Josep Borrell trip to Moscow half a year ago, when they tried to preempt his potential attempts to quote unquote teach the Russian leadership about how they should treat the political opposition, or more specifically, the case of Alexei Navalny. I don't think that at this particular juncture, the Russian leadership is interested in escalation. I don't think that they are willing or they are ready for a new cycle of confrontation with the West. The major preoccupations are clearly domestic. The Russian leadership has to face elections to the State Duma in September, which will be a difficult election for the Russian leadership. It is very hard to imagine how the United Russia Party is capable of maintaining its current positions in the Russian parliament. But at the same time, it is important to notice that though the Russian leadership is not interested in escalation, it is not ready for any unilateral concessions or any gestures of goodwill that would demonstrate that the Kremlin is ready to change its overall behavior. Now, speaking of the European Union in a more precise way, I think that the main dilemma that the Kremlin is struggling around is whether the idea of strategic autonomy of the European Union is for real. Indeed, with the accession of the Biden administration and the restoration of the transatlantic dialogue, many in the Russian leadership argue that the European Union has dropped its intention to become less dependent on the United States. Indeed, it is ready to follow any decisions that can be made in Washington, D.C. In fact, the European reaction to the US withdrawal from the INF Treaty and later the reaction to the US withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty were used as a manifestation of very limited, if any, strategic autonomy of the European Union from the United States. If you assume that the strategic autonomy is just a Macron idea, which is not shared or supported by other European leaders, then basically there is no much sense talking to the European Union. If you have to deal with real problems, you go to Washington, not to Brussels. And definitely that is related primarily to security matters. On the other hand, if you deal with issues of trade and investment, then why should you go to Brussels if you can deal with your partners in Berlin, in Rome, and in Paris? So in a way, the European Union is stuck between the United States, which is perceived as the strategic arch opponent of the Russian Federation, and individual European capitals, which are considered to be benign and sometimes benevolent partners on economic and technological matters. Now, having said that, and I understand that my time is run out, let me conclude by saying that I don't see any opportunities for an institutional arrangement between Brussels and Moscow. Russia is not strong enough to be considered by the European Union as an equal partner. Even together with other members of the Eurasian Economic Union, Russia is still too weak to deal with Russia on a peer basis. On the other hand, Russia is not weak enough to accept the European Union as an unquestioned model of modernity, especially today when we have other models of modernity to the east of Russia's borders. So I don't think that there can be any institutional arrangement between Russia and the European Union anytime soon. We tried almost everything. We tried pan-European institutions in early 1990s. We tried a special status of Russia associated to Western institutions like the Russian NATO Council and for spaces with the European Union. It has not worked either. We tried Europe based on two foundations, the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union, but it's not going to work either. So I don't see an institutional framework in which Russia and the EU can reconcile their current relationship. On the other hand, I think that there are small but still not insignificant opportunities that we should probably discuss, and that includes the European Green Deal and its implications for Russia. I think that the recent trip of Secretary Kerry to Moscow suggests that Russia is starting getting serious. It is still an open question how serious the Kremlin is going to be, but I think it is definitely more serious than it was 2 or 3 years ago. We can definitely work on transportation, specifically on 5G. I would also argue that trans-border cooperation is an opportunity, and maybe even what I would call out-of-area issues, including places like Syria and Libya. Given the recent extension of the last year United Nations Security Council resolution on Syria, I think it opens limited but still not insignificant space for Russia and the European Union working together in places of the MENA region, and maybe, though I think it's much less likely, maybe in the common neighborhood as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. This was a very thought-provoking intervention, and also exactly right on time. So, you know, it's the dream of a moderator of a panel. So thank you so much for this. Let me move now to Sergei, Dr. Guriev, because as also the High Representative has commented on many occasions, the fact is that economically, Russia and the EU are very complementary and they really need each other. And despite that, for reasons that have been partly explained so far, their relations are at a historic low. You know, how do you see, you know, this contradiction between how much we need each other and how little we seem to get along with each other? Thank you, Sergei.
Thank you, Nacho. Thank you for inviting me. That's a great pleasure and honor to speak at this distinguished panel. I'll try to be reasonably brief to leave time for the discussion, because the main question you're asking has in fact been answered by Andrei, who said that Russian government's priorities shifted from prosperity to security, or whatever they call security. And in political economy, we always think about the main interests of any regime, on any government, any ruling elite, just to stay in power. And in the first 10 years of 21st century, that required prosperity. So the model of first 10 years of Putin was economic growth, rising incomes, and that model, of course, exactly involved cooperation with European Union, with other partners. But of course, European Union, by definition, as you rightly said, Nacho, is complementary to Russia, is close to Russia. In trade and investment, distance matters, and the economists know that gravity model works. So your closest trade partners are the ones next to you. So it's not a surprise that the biggest trade partners of Russia are actually EU and China, and EU dominates China still. So we should be surprised that when Russian government was interested in economic growth, cooperation was actually moving forward. And I remind you that just 10 years ago, EU and Russia were discussing partnership for modernization, special deals, as Andrei mentioned, because Russia would need European technology, Russia would need cooperation in education, human capital, in institutions. Mr. Putin was talking about four common spaces and integration in the sense that Russia would become part of Europe, would go as far as adopting everything but the institutional membership. But that talk stopped exactly when the priorities of the regime shifted around 7 years ago. The explanation of that is very simple. When Russia exhausted sources of growth and started to understand that further growth requires fighting corruption, reducing domination of state companies, creating business climate that would actually help create new middle class. Of course, that was politically dangerous for the government. And so they started to look for new sources of legitimacy. And eventually they found it in geopolitical adventures, annexation of Crimea, the war against Ukraine. And that worked. Interestingly, that worked, and it worked for quite a few years. I think the increase in popularity of Mr. Putin and his regime in 2014 and subsequent years was surprising, not just for outside observers, but also for the elite as well, for Mr. Putin as well. But in any event, it worked with one big cost, which was isolation of Russia from the rest of the world, most importantly from the West. And so there were sanctions and counter sanctions, and so trade and FDI, foreign direct investment, went down. And today, Russia receives foreign direct investment, which is just a fraction of good years that had to be were the case before 2014. So we shouldn't be surprised there. Yes, Russia and EU need each other, but for domestic political purposes, Russian government pursues different priorities. Now, this model stops working, and Andrei has talked about that, saying that popularity of Mr. Putin is coming down, popularity of his party, United Russia, is coming down big time, and yet the regime still is invested in this model based on corruption, domination of the state in the economy, domination of business people close to political leaders, and isolation from the West. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the status quo, unfortunately, is likely to continue, because this is what, for the regime, is a safer bet in terms of staying in power. So we shouldn't be surprised. I would say that it's not something unique. If you think about another country next to Europe, Turkey, the Turkish economy is also complementary to the European economy. There was an accession process. There is a customs union. So Turkey has actually gone farther than Russia in terms of integration with Europe. And this process has been stalled, reversed, paused, exactly because the leadership of Turkey also chooses other priorities. And in that sense, we shouldn't be surprised that sometimes economic reality is being sidelined and trumped by domestic political priorities. And this is what we unfortunately see in Russia. To what extent that may change? I would say that unfortunately, I don't expect that to change in coming years, as long as the current government is in power. And the current government is actually quite skilled in staying in power. You may think that they are not good in generating income growth. Russian economy is stagnating. Incomes of Russian households are 10% lower than 8 years ago. You think that that is quite a disastrous economic track record. But this group of people are international grandmasters in terms of staying in power. And we should think that it's not going to be easy to shift to another equilibrium. So unfortunately, I remain pessimistic for the time being. Eventually, Russia will become part of wider Europe in whatever capacity. But as of today, I think, unfortunately, the current low level of economic and political dialogue will remain. Thank you.
And as a follow-up question, maybe this in the 3 remaining minutes, Sergei, this is something which the High Rep has commented also recently, the fact that as Europe decarbonizes, it will also be less dependent on Russia. So interactions will be lower and lower, or even more problematic if there are carbon adjustment mechanisms or taxes and so on. So this relationship is also, or the two countries will be drifting farther away also economically, right?
Nacho, this is a question which depends on the horizon. The decarbonization of Europe is accelerating, and I think what's been achieved in the last couple of years is unprecedented in terms of decisions made, roadmaps designed, and so on. But the real decarbonization will happen over the next 10 years. And over the next 10 years, I'm actually quite optimistic regarding Russian political scene. I think this regime cannot continue dominating Russia for 10 or 15 years. This is just impossible to imagine. But so over the long run, I think Russia will decarbonize as well. Russia is actually waking up to the reality, and Europe is playing a key role here. A carbon border adjustment mechanism is a big wake-up call for Russia. I remember that a year ago, when you talked to Russian government officials about energy, green energy transition, they would say it's an abstraction. Today, Russian energy policymakers are actually talking about specific changes in Russia. If you think about the discussions in St. Petersburg Economic Forum, half of the panels would mention something about decarbonization, not just in Europe, but also the need of decarbonizing Russia, exactly because the Russian exporters would face carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, the impact of carbon border adjustment mechanism on Russian exports is actually not large. So only about $10 billion of Russian exports to Europe will be immediately exposed to the mechanism. And the tax Russian exporters would pay would be in the order of magnitude of 1 billion or 2 billion, which is a tenth of a percent of Russian GDP. So it's not a macroeconomic amount. But for a specific exporter, it's a pain. And a specific exporter of steel is a rich person who can lobby quite successfully within Russia. So I think I won't say these countries, Europe and Russia, will be pushed further apart. Moreover, I think it's likely that Russia will wake up to the realities of decarbonization and will actually become a much more sustainable economy in longer term, of course, not tomorrow. And because Russia also produces a lot of metals which are needed for batteries, Russia has a lot of potential in renewable energy, including wind and solar and geothermal. And in that sense, I'm actually thinking that there'll be potentially a lot more cooperation between Russia and Europe in decarbonizing Russia. And I'm actually quite hopeful regarding this, because if you can call Europe a geopolitical dwarf, you can think about various ways in Europe is behind other parts of the world, but in terms of green technology, Europe is a superpower, and not just in developing green technology, but in rolling it out because of political pressure to do that. Europe is a place where you have consensus between left and right, and decarbonization must happen, which differentiates Europe from many other places in the world.
Well, this is great, and also a bit of an optimistic note to end on your intervention. Thank you so much. Let me now move to Ivan Krastev. If there is something valuable that I've learned from you, Ivan, in all these years, is your observation that in every bilateral relation there are four people, right? There is one, the other, what one thinks of the other, and what the other thinks of you. And this, I think, makes for a fantastic introduction to the question that I wanted to address to you, is that, what are these misperceptions that are dominant? We've heard about the perceptions, but also there are misperceptions. Are we just getting each other wrong, or it is that we just have different interests when we speak of the EU and Russia? Thank you, Ivan.
Thank you very much. Basically, what you have learned from me, I have learned from Judge Oliver Holmes, who said that in the relations between two persons, there are always 6 actors. How each of the persons view themselves how they view each other, but also how they are viewed by God. On this case, of course, I cannot offer the God perspective, but I do believe it really makes sense to try to see how basically at this very moment European Union views itself, how it views Russia, and also how Russia views itself and how it views the European Union. And I'm saying this because I'm in agreement both with Andrei and Sergei that in the short term, what we should expect is, using the pandemic language, is social distancing. I hope it's not going to happen something really bad, but for the reasons that have been very well explained by the previous speakers, there is no political or economic pressure now, both for the Russia or for the European Union, to expect any breakthrough. But what is changing is, first, how the European Union views itself. Listen, there was a moment in which the European Union was viewing itself as the laboratory of the world to come. If you go back to 20 years ago, we believe that we're the model, and the European idea of a post-sovereign type of state politics, basically international relations based on economic interdependencies and others, have been very much the model that European Union was viewing itself, and European Union always tries to view itself very much as a benevolent actor. So when we talk about misperceptions, we should be also clear that we can have also misperceptions not about Russia only, but also about ourselves. And I do believe it's true also very much about Russia, not simply how they view us, but how they view themselves. And when we have been looking to Russia, the basic problem is what Europeans were seeing is economically underdeveloped country that is in a kind of a big pressure to modernize, and European Union is the model for modernization. Also, I do believe, starting from the moment of the Cold War, there was one principal problem in the relations between European Union and Russia, is that for a long time we have been using Russia and Soviet Union as synonymous. During the Cold War, but then after even the Cold War, basically many of the policies that we're seeing were perceived much more as the policies that past dependency coming from the past, and we try to explain everything through the nature of the regime and basically the way the regime was connected to the previous one. My major story is that the biggest problem in the relations between Russia and the European Union is that at the present moment, both sides see the other as a declining powers. Is it, could be right or wrong? But on one level, Russia always has a huge problem with kind of a post-sovereign nature of the European nation state, because in a certain way, Russia was born out of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this is one of the interesting stories. When in the 1990s, there was a very strong and, in my view, genuine hopes, both in the West and in Moscow, that they're going to be a much more cooperative relationship. What we misrecognized was that liberal order, in the way it came at the end of the Cold War, was much more attractive to the Soviet Union than for Russia. Because at the end of the Soviet days, particularly President Gorbachev was looking at the European frame as the way to basically weaken nationalist mobilization on the territory of the Soviet Union. He was basically believed that this type of a liberal frame is going to allow the Soviet Union to survive, not as a communist empire, but basically as a much more multinational federation. The moment when it collapsed, in a certain way, Russia, in the understanding of the nation building, was not much different than the other countries in the post-Soviet space. So from this point of view, Russia was a former empire, but in a certain way, it was also a kind of a post-colonial state that was looking for different type of a political identity, national identity. And this preoccupation with security, not only in military terms, but also in cultural terms, is critically important. So this is why now when Russia looks at the world, it starts more and more to think in terms of the civilizational spaces. I was very much, to be honest, kind of shocked by the long essay that President Putin wrote recently and published on the Kremlin.ru website, in which he's very much reflecting on the relations between Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, because this is a classical idea of the civilizational spaces. It's not simply a classical sphere of interest, but sphere of interest based on a cultural proximities between this and that. And this is an interesting story. And by the way, I do believe this is going to be an interesting text for for this university to discuss, because these can create a major problem in the relationships. I hope my intuition is wrong, but I'll not be surprised, and I'm very much interested where Andrei and Sergei stay on this, that in the next year or two, we can see a much more brave steps on the side of Moscow, particularly when it comes to reintegration of places like Belarus. This is not, and this kind of idea that the world is moving to the civilizational spaces, that we are kind of in a world in which the middle powers should try to use the opening of the space in order to make their claims, which are both cultural, political, territorial, are critically important, because I do believe all this period Russia is very much pushing for relevance. And they're pushing for relevance in which they understand perfectly well the economic competitiveness, and also some of the competitiveness coming from the natural resources that have been so important in the Russia position before can change. So from this point of view, Russia sees the European Union as declining power because Russia does not believe that the European model is going to survive. And I'm sure that there are many people in the Russian leadership, and don't forget, this is the generation that was totally shaped by the collapse of the Soviet Union. They're asking the question why Soviet Union collapsed and the European Union should survive. So, and listen, this is a strong personal experience. It's about ideology, it's about interest, but it's also about experience. And this idea to try to think in analogies is, in my view, one of the most important things about not just the President Putin, but the whole generation that is now shaping Russian foreign policy. And I'm very much interested in what is going to happen when the next generation is going to come, which does not need to be more liberal or more democratic, but they're simply coming from a different experience. And then on the European Union, on the other side, we basically managed to convince ourselves that the future very much is rooted in the strengths of your economy, that very much kind of the military power is not irrelevant, but what you can expect with the military power is just to protect yourself, but you're not going to remake the world. And from this point of view, when European Union and basically the West in general talks to Russia, we go from one extreme to another. Either we claim that Russia is totally irrelevant. Obama's famous basically statement about Russia being a regional power, which I do believe forced President Putin to try to basically convince him that it is not as simple, trying to act also in the American domestic politics. But on the other side, we also have this idea to try to explain many of the internal problems that our societies has, simply on the basis of the Russian interventions. Listen, I'm sure that basically Russia interferes politically, and Russia is trying to weaponize the vulnerabilities of the Western democracies, but to explain that everything that is going wrong in our societies or any problems that the European Union is facing is just the result of the Russian covert operations, this is as realistic as to believe that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the American covert operation that succeeded. And I'm saying this because of this type of sensitivities. It is so difficult to have the relationship that is going to be based on something which is slightly more fundamental. For us, it's very difficult to understand what is a Russia's legitimate state interest and where the interests of the Russia's regime, which, and I very much agree with Sergei, the problem with this type of regimes is they have the same problem that the beauty queens have. They have the problem with aging. And you see the aging problem very strongly. And on the other side, we have something that Andrei Kortunov has been writing around 2 or 3 years ago, which I do believe is fundamental. For the first time, Russian society is much more Europeanized than the Russian elite. As a way of life, as movement of people, as, by the way, also sensibility. You have the Europeanization that goes within the Russian societies, and particularly urban middle classes, which in my view is unprecedented. And he is there. So as a result of it, we very much fear each other and try to explain all the problems that we face with each other. On the other side, we don't know what is the positive breakthrough that can come. So as I said, I want to agree with the others that nevertheless, what are our perceptions or misperceptions, at the moment, I don't see what is the kind of perceptions of the outside world that are going to push Russia and the European Union to cooperate in a much more constructive and pragmatic way. So what I see in the short term is much more kind of a conciliation between pragmatism and kind of a hysteria, and this is going to be, unfortunately, the mode of the relationship that we're going to have. On the long term, I do believe this is going to change on both sides, by the way. Russia is going to change, probably European Union is going to change in one way or the other, but at least in the next 3 or 4 years, in my view, it's very important not to create for ourselves an expectations totally unrealistic, because then these expectations can backfire on each other. Because what I see on the Russian side, but also on the European side, we have been expecting so much wrongly from each other in different periods that now we are so annoyed to each other that we are not ready to cooperate even in areas which is not so difficult to cooperate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ivan, also for a very interesting intervention, also for adjusting to the time. Voy a dirigirme entonces ahora a darle la palabra a Carmen, que yo creo que además Iván nos ha dejado esta imagen de
Carmen, because Ivan has just presented this image of the European Union and Russia as two intermediate powers that are looking for their strategic autonomy, and with a civilizational project that I think is interesting, very interesting. And this allows me to send you the question, Carmen, and that is, how do you see the European Union from Carmen? In other words, how are we perceived from Russia? So what are the perceptions that you've observed there? Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Well, how are we perceived from Russia? Well, it depends on who you put the question to. Because until now, we've spoken a lot about politics in the highest levels. But I think that what we should do, we should also discover what our citizens, what the citizens here in this country think of the European Union. So we have very few objective data to analyze the situation, and with the very few data we have, what we should do, I think, is carry out studies at the Nevada Center before the Kremlin closes the place down, after having stigmatized this center for so many years. And it's rated this organization as an enemy, as a foreign agent. And these opinion polls of the Institute point out some very interesting things. Among other things, what they say is that Russian society doesn't have such a negative outlook in terms of the European Union, as is suggested by the official speeches, or as you would think after listening to the official speech. So, for instance, in November of last year, for example, and in the survey that was carried out to ask if the modern Russia, if it has any enemies, it's very interesting to see that a majority, that is 70% of those surveyed, say that the big enemy of Russia is the United States, and that is not very surprising because 70% of the people said that. However, when they mention the European Union, it's only 7%. 7% of the people believe that the European Union is an enemy. And the curious thing is that, well, below this value, there's another concept that appears that is called the West. And you can see that the West receives only 5%, less than the European Union as an enemy. And what is even more curious and what is even more interesting is the fact that China appears as an enemy of Russia, but with 4%. And below China, and right now, China is supposed to be the major ally and partner of Russia, but below China we have NATO. NATO with 3%, only 3%, when NATO, as we all know perfectly well, is considered by the Kremlin as one of the biggest problems in terms of security for Russia. So this is what we have in relation to the perception of enemies. And then there's another very interesting thing. There's another survey here. And what they've asked people is, what is your attitude in relation to the United States? Well, and after this figure of 70% that I gave you before, when people say that the United States is the enemy, but this is a very interesting thing, because when the question has to do with your own personal opinion, well, generally, positive responses were 38%, above the generic position, which was 28%. So in other words, here we have, I think it's we have many more details, and I think that we have a much clearer picture compared to what the previous survey says. And when you ask people, when you ask them what it is they think about the European Union, what is their attitude towards the EU, well, the positive position would be 49%. And the, let's say that the negative, a very negative position would be 37%. So here we have a clear difference in favor of a positive view of the European Union. And finally, and just to finish with all these surveys, there's another very interesting question, and which is as follows. Do you consider, or how do you think Russia should treat the Western world? Well, a majority of people, that is 67% of these individuals, and this majority has been maintained until and since the year 2016, and the figure has even increased. 67% of them consider that Russia should treat the European Union as a partner. And those of you that consider that they should be considered as an enemy are only at 3%, and as well as a rival, 16%. And I think that this is what this is telling us. It's telling us many things, of course. So therefore, what I mean to say is that here, Russian society, well, not Russian society, but the society of Russia, but the society of Russia is a completely different thing compared to the Russian society. So therefore, the society of Russia, therefore, has a very, very specific perception of what the European Union is like. But as we all know, the Kremlin has a completely different narrative in relation to this perception of the European Union, because Andrea has already brought forward several things, and so have Sergei and Ivan, and they've said several things that will probably mean that I'm going to be repeating myself a bit. But anyway, what I would dare say, I would like to point out three issues. Well, four main issues. Well, to start off with, and we have the predominant discourse of the Kremlin has transformed us citizens of the web in what they call the collective West. And this would be a conglomerate of international actors, of states and organizations, and which are those that criticize Russia systematically. However, the rest of the world, well, they are friendly and they are cooperative with Russia too. And they do not tell them off continuously because of Crimea or Navalny, and they don't apply unfair sanctions, etc., etc. And this is a way that is pretty astute of becoming a whole without a personality. And this is a whole that is managed by Washington, which would be the big boss. And this is something, well, we have to take into account that this is a presentation of the European Union that I think works pretty well in many sectors in Africa and Latin America, at least as far as I know. And possibly the same applies to Asia, because, well, we could also see the same thing in certain European sectors, of course. So we, as I say, we are the collective West when, as has already been pointed out by Andrei and by Sergei, well, Russia likes bilateral relationship where everything is very clear and where you can impose your point of view and where you can also reach agreements. But I think that in addition to that, I think that Moscow or the Kremlin, they've never really fully understood what the European Union is all about. And I think that, as has already been mentioned too, they believe that the European Union is a non-actor in foreign affairs.
But in any case, I will go back to what you mentioned, Nacho. I will refer to the text of Andrei Kortunov, because it's a really very interesting text, and he explains very clearly that Russia believes that the EU is like a political dwarf, and he describes the EU as a non-entity in terms of security policy issues. But, on the other hand, in the Kremlin talks about the EU as an existential threat for Russia, a threat that could endanger its survival. And in 2014, and obviously this is associated with the events in Ukraine, Sergei Karavanov, who's he's a Russian analyst, who's a very well-known expert and is also a very influential person in Moscow, and also has a lot of influence on the Kremlin circles. He said that the Western strategy, and this is a quote by the way, it's based on misunderstandings and on errors of calculation. And this misunderstanding is related to the fact that this is deep down a confrontation that has to do with the Ukraine. But for the Russians, it's something much more important than that. It's a struggle to prevent others expanding their spheres of control in territories that we Russians consider to be vital for the survival of the country. So then you ask yourself, why is it that Russian survival would be threatened by the EU and by the Western world? Because, as Ivan says, because we think that we are a benevolent power. But even if this vision is too indulgent towards ourselves, I think that if we were to think about this carefully, well, we really couldn't say that the European Union represents any kind of threat for the survival of Russia. Why? Well, because as it's explained by Karaganov, and as was explained too by Andrei, at least in part, because of this strip of European territory that is between the European Union and Russia, and this little strip of post-Soviet European territory, and it's this grey space. Well, this isn't really home affairs for Russia, and it's not either foreign affairs for Russia. It's something that's in between. It's something that is in between both dimensions. But in any case, let's say that it's this strip that has to do with a sphere of vital interest vis-à-vis the Western world, generally speaking. And why? Well, because they consider that the enlargement of the EU, and especially of NATO, they consider that this represents a threat, and it also clearly shows that it is a threat because it's getting closer and closer to the Russian borders. And this enlargement, well, obviously cannot be explained just because you're expressing an option that has been chosen by the societies of these countries, but rather this has to do with the maneuvers carried out by the West and by the European Union in these countries to remove the Russian influence and make Russia more fragile, or to weaken Russia. And in a speech given at the Federal Assembly in February of 2020, the Russian president said that Russia has been and will always be a sovereign and independent state. And he said that without sovereignty, Russia cannot be a state, because some countries can do that, but not Russia. And this comment was obviously aimed at the European Union and at the member countries. But I think that what it does show is to what extent the Kremlin doesn't consider that its European neighbors, in other words, this grey strip that I mentioned before, to what extent these European citizens that are pro-Soviets have the right to aspire to the same thing. And I think that this is obviously a very post-colonial kind of approach. And then finally, to conclude my presentation, there's another dimension that has to do with the vision we have in terms of the Russia, of official Russia, but also of Russian society. from the viewpoint of the EU, and which has to do with the civilizational spaces that Ivan Kristev has that mentioned before. And it's not what you said, Ivan, but I think that it is somewhat related. And it's this other vision that Moscow has on the EU. In other words, that we are a perverted and decadent society. And the implementation of multiple retrograde and homophobic regulations show that this discourse is not just about rhetoric. It's something that is extremely serious, and it's symbolized by a name that is used in relation to us, especially in highly viewed programs on Russian television, and that is they call Europe. They call it Europa. In other words, they call it a gay Europe. The gay Europe. That's the term they use. And here there's another quote, and with this I'm going to finish. But what we can see how many Euro-Atlantic countries are now rejecting their roots, including the Christian values that form part of the basis of our Western civilization. They are denying the moral principles and all of the traditional identities, whether they be national, cultural, religious, and even sexual. So what they're doing is implementing policies that compare large families with couples of the same sex. They compare it with the belief in God and the belief in the devil. And these are words from the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carmen, for this talk. And now we're going to proceed on to the discussion. We have the High Representative of the Commission, Mr. Borrell. I would like to give him the floor, most particularly because of his recent visit to Moscow, and the article where he talks about the different ideas about Russia, and also he makes himself a certain number of questions. What do Russia want, if they want this bilateral relationship or not? What are the terms of this relationship? So, High Representative Josep Borrell, if you have any interesting matter, you can share it with us. Thank you. I think the intervention is on microphone. He has to take off his cask. Thank you. Thank you. Can you get the sound? Sorry, there was a slight glitches at the beginning. Can you hear me now? Yeah? Okay, so we start. When I say Russia, we have can you just adjust the sound level? Thank you. I was just thanking the members of the panel. Yes, can you hear me? Maybe, yeah, you're very far away, I'm afraid. Can we just test it? I'm fine. I can hear Mr. Borrell okay. I'm the interpreter. I was just thanking the panelists for their speeches and their remarks on the EU and Russia. When I say Russia, I refer to the Russian government and the political system with Putin at his head. I also, I'm not talking about all the citizens, because Carmen has mentioned it. they haven't got the same vision as the one put forward by Kremlin. For Kremlin, for the political system, it is quite clear that the EU, if it's weakest, it is better, the best. If it didn't exist, it would be even better. If you have to get in touch with a number of countries, if they are not united, it's the best for them. Of course, as you know, if the bargaining conventions or agreement didn't exist, it would be better for the entrepreneurs. And if all the countries would have to fight with their own strength, if they had to face Russia, it would be better for Russia. That's why they just want to go beyond the EU to get in touch with those countries that interest them. They clearly say that the EU does not interest them, and then afterwards they try to present the EU as a political dwarf. We are not a giant, and they underestimate the EU power and the links existing between the different member states. So if I am fine with those who buy the gas and with those who I'm a friend, it's enough. The EU does not interest me. And we do not interest Russia if we talk about human rights, of course. When we say, oh, you have signed the European Convention on Human Rights, and we are a part of that, and I want to know if this is respected in your country. And they say you have no way to interfere in our domestic affairs. And we cannot ask these questions. We cannot make questions about Navalny or in general about the human rights in Russia. It is not our affairs, they say. And if someone talks about that, they find themselves facing a wall. So from the European perspective, it was quite clear in the last European Council that the differences are huge between the standpoint of Germany and France. They want to celebrate a summit with Putin, as Biden did, and most particularly the Baltic states that are denying the fact that they can talk with Russia. If Crimea is not given to Ukraine, we have nothing to say to Russia. This situation is there, and so the dialogue with Russia is at a standstill. And the European Council decided not to celebrate this summit in any case. Of course, the negotiations are not only made through a summit, they can be done in a different way. I'm not sure that the summit with Putin in front of 27 would be the ideal situation. And first of all, we have to agree upon what we have to say to Putin. In this summit, we could also let clear what are our discrepancies among the European states. We have no summits, and now we have to find a way to relate with China, with the five famous principles: the compliance of Russia to meet the Minsk agreement as a first step, or the three verbs: constrain, push back, and engage. Limit, but also get in touch. And this is more operational. And Russia, we have to constrain their attitudes, we have to reject them, push back, but also we have to engage. That's to say, we have a certain number of policies where Russia is fundamental. No one can expect to have a policy on the Arctic without counting on Russia. And we cannot talk about our energetic independence without talking with Russia. And this is the case with many other topics. Russia is one of the biggest gas supplier, not for all the member states, but for some of the most important. So there are discrepancies that appear, and the relation with Russia is a dividing topic. I understand that for the Russian authorities, the EU is not a matter of safety or security. Europe is not a military alliance. It is not, and is not going to be, but the NATO is. And also we have seen the enlargement of the NATO in this gray area zone of the former Soviet states. They were going to be a buffer in this neutral area, and it hasn't been like that. So the proximity of these states and the will to belong to the NATO has generated on the part of the political Russian system a reality that we understand. So the idea of being surrounded by member states of the NATO is not for the Kremlin something that could increase or should increase its security sense. So therefore, the Western world has to think about how we have used our cards. This was after the adhesion of Russia. We have to also bear in mind that those countries were a safety guarantee, but it wasn't a threat really for Russia. So the situation is quite tense for the time being, and for the European Union, this situation is not very good to have this relationship with Russia, because as I've mentioned, many member states, starting from Germany, they need to have with Russia good relations. And there is a figure I want to put on the table for you to better understand the foreign investment in Russia. 70%, 75% come from the EU. So should we be friends or enemies? Those who are putting the eggs in the basket of the Russian economy is the EU. So 75% of the trade exchanges come from the EU. So we have a major strategic importance, and from our point of view, our relation is not only a relation full of conflict, but it is also a partnership relationship. Our companies are investing in Russia. Three-quarters of the investment that is going to Russia comes from the EU. So we not only depend on the gas, but there is also a trade relationship which is important, relevant for both sides. So that's why we have to find negotiations, and I'm sure that Russia would prefer to get on well with the member states than to have to negotiate with the trade union, so to better negotiate. So we are very far from there. I understand what Lavrov says. You shouldn't interfere in what has been part of my territory, that's to say, the backyard.
And all I have to do is reach an agreement with your partners. And this is where we have the problem related to the parties, and that is, well, the parties, well, playing at this game and negotiating with Russia bilaterally, or, well, you can accept to do so collectively. And it's not clear either. And as I say, it's not clear that all the member states are going to be really respecting the union in relation to Russia or any other stakeholder. So it's not clear for some of them, or depending on the circumstances, some of them would also prefer to play the bilateral card or the bilateral option. Instead of things doing together or not, our relationship will be completely different depending on whether you follow one path or the other. And I think that I've answered with that. I think that now we can move on to putting questions to our panelists. Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Borrell. I think that that was also extremely interesting. And I would like to know if any of the panelists, before we collect your questions, Ibai, Sergei, Ivan, or Carmen, would you like to make any comments, or do you have any questions for the High Representative? Because I would like you all to be able to participate, even if it's briefly.
Said each other or something? You want to join? No? Ivan, Andrei, Carmen? Are you okay? Carmen? And Andrei as well. So Carmen and then Andrei, please.
Oh, okay.
Carmen.
It has to do with what saying that the outside world now in Russian society wasn't seen anymore as an opportunity. True, but there is also another study of Levada, a very recent one, in July, about immigration. And, ay, perdón, si yo tengo que hablar en español, es verdad.
Puedes hablar en lo que quieras.
Según esta encuesta del Centro Levada, de este mes de junio,
survey of this month of July, 1 out of 5 Russians has expressed the wish to leave Russia and to go to leave Russia. So 22%. This is the highest rate since 2013, before the events in Ukraine. So what is most interesting is that the great majority of these people wanting to leave are youngsters. So if half of the surveyed 48% have among 18 and 28 years old.
I mean, you might be right about the outside world being more challenging than opportunity, but obviously a fifth part of the population is really willing to leave.
Okay. Andrei, please.
First of all, let me say that I personally really have a lot of admiration for High Representative's commitment and stamina in dealing with Moscow, especially after the cold shower that he got there during his last visit. I think it's really something which deserves a lot of respect from our side. But the question which I have is rather specific, and it relates to what I would label as out of area cooperation opportunities between Brussels and Moscow. We see a lot of developments in conflict areas, especially in the MENA region, but not only. We have some kind of de-escalation in Libya. We see the last year resolution of the UN Security Council on Syria extended, so hopefully there'll be no humanitarian catastrophe in Idlib. We see a rapid change of the situation in Afghanistan and potential instability there. We also see some kind of messy situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. Russia takes pride for its assumed ability to participate in peacekeeping and conflict resolution, but Russia has never been particularly strong in post-conflict reconstruction. I understand that it is not easy to make any generalizations, but I wonder whether you see any opportunities for EU-Russia collaboration, or at least for some kind of parallel activities in terms of post-conflict reconstruction in conflict areas in the MENA region and maybe even on the territory of the former Soviet Union. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Andrei. No sé si alto representante quiere responder ahora a esta pregunta sobre las oportunidades de cooperación y entonces abrimos el debate con la gente en la sala, si le parece, Josep.
De cooperación las hay, sin duda. En los territorios de la ex Unión Soviética.
Soviet Union territories is much more difficult. In Ukraine, we have conflictive situation. This is a critical situation. In Belarus, the cooperation possibilities are non-existent. There's conflict that is supported by Moscow, and in the Caucasian area, it is with Turkey that Russia is cooperating, and in Syria, quite the same happens. We are fighting for Russia to open the border in order to have access to Syria. In Libya, it is quite the same. The cooperation between Turkey and Russia is leading to a certain number of agreements, as the ones made by Astan, and also in the Caucasian area, it is quite the same. And the EU has nothing to do there and cannot play any kind of role in those in this context. And so the cooperation possibilities are much more cross-sectional in functional aspects more than territorial aspects. The energetic transition is one topic. All those issues on technological advances, for example, the cyber security and everything, they need a cooperation with us. Of course, the ecological transition, the green transition, so they need to cooperate with us. The gas in the gas field, we will reduce if we meet the Green Deal. We are going to reduce the acquisition of these products. So Russia will have to turn to another buyer because they are extracting this gas, but they will have to search other buyers because we won't buy these resources, and maybe this buyer could be China. Of course, it depends upon the transition, and the geopolitical alliance is going to change because less gas for Europe and more gas for China will be more dependent. So this is not what we want. So if we look for alternative solutions and energy mix we are seeking, which is the counterpart of the financial mix, of the Russian financial mix, would be great. If we leave things on the way, they will be changed on the geopolitical scenario, and they won't be in our advantage. Common grounds exist, the cross-sectionals, the functional ones, and the territorial ones. When I say territorial, if you look at the territorial spaces, you can see that in merely no one. There is a room for cooperation, but there is a need to reduce tension, most particularly in the case of Ukraine. But I don't think this is going to be very soon. If we have member states of the EU that wants to have the devolution of Crimea to Ukraine to start a dialogue, of course, the possibilities of a dialogues are very few.
If our speakers would bear with us and would stay for 10 more minutes, and then we will close. Is it okay? You have 10 more minutes, so we can then have questions from the audience, and then bring this to an end. María Ángeles, por favor, tú que estás en la sala y tienes ojos y oídos mejores que los nuestros.
Of course, we now are opening the Q&A session. As we have very little time, I think we are going to take 3 questions, and I please ask you to be brief in your question. We have a question at the back of the room and 2 more here. A 4th one maybe, but then we have to close. Thank you.
Andrei Kortunov. So, considering the U.S. military withdrawal from Afghanistan, how do Russian government evaluate this tactical movement and its consequences in such a hotspot region as the Middle East is? Thank you.
Muchas gracias también por la brevedad. Tenemos una allí detrás y 2 aquí delante.
Una pregunta muy rápida a cualquiera de los ponentes. El problema principal que ve Rusia en la Unión Europea no es...
For Russia and the EU is not as an exporting of human rights to end the situation. But also, I have another question. The EU should focus on its affairs, but they are also involved in the Catalan issue, and if they cannot be on the scene, they are just mingling and poking the nose in other affairs. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. For the High Representative, why the relationship of the EU has been so weak when Russia has attacked Ukraine and they have invaded and annexed Crimea province? Thank you. Thank you. Another question? For the High Representative, 2 questions. How do the Baltic republics consider our relationship with Russia? And the States hasn't said anything about Ukraine. And also another question for Andrei. I am more of the Galaxy War, and I don't know if Mr. Putin is on the side of the Force, and as in the Star Wars. And so the interference of Russia in the EU and also the attack of Russia on Ukraine and the relationship with the Baltic states, members of the EU, but also very well related with Russia. So you got the floor. The sound is not very good. I'm sorry. For Spanish, for the sound in the room, I think there were 2 questions for Andrei on Afghanistan and about the interferences for him. Andrei, the
Spanish in this case, domestic affairs. Please, can you start with that?
Yeah, let me. Thank you for your questions. First of all, on Afghanistan. Unlike the case of Syria, Russia is not likely to be the deal maker in Afghanistan. We have two powers which I think are going to play the most important role as external players after the United States and the international coalition are out of the country. We have China with major economic interests in Afghanistan, with resources to invest, specifically to invest into the Afghan infrastructure. And we have Pakistan, which enjoys long-term relations with Taliban that go back to 1980s, maybe even earlier. And definitely these powers are going to be the prime external players for the situation in Afghanistan. As far as Russia is concerned, there are essentially three goals or three priorities that Moscow has in this country. First of all, to avoid a potential spillover effect of instability. And maybe you have already heard that many Afghan soldiers and civilians are trying to cross the border with Tajikistan, escaping Taliban and political change in the country. And of course, this potential instability is something that strategists in the Kremlin should pay attention to. Second, to avoid a situation when Afghanistan can become a launching pad for terrorist activities in Central Asia and in Russia proper, which might be the case if Taliban, God forbid, cuts a deal with either Al Qaeda or ISIS, and the Taliban, in this case, will take care of the domestic situation in the country, and these terrorist groups will use Taliban to plan and to execute their terrorist attacks in Central Asia, in Xinjiang or elsewhere. And of course, the third goal that Russia has in Afghanistan is to limit, if not to eliminate, the drug traffic coming from Afghanistan. Russia remains one of the major markets for the Afghan-produced opium, and the production of opium in Afghanistan increased dramatically during the foreign escalation over the last 20 years. So essentially, Russia's goals in Afghanistan are limited, but they are not insignificant. I think that Russia will pursue opportunities for multilateral cooperation, maybe in the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also within the CSTO framework, especially cooperation with Central Asian states in the military field and in the intelligence field. It's now hard to tell, how the situation in Afghanistan emerges within the next couple of weeks, but definitely the country will have to go through a period of major instability, and the challenges to all neighboring states will be very significant. Now, in terms of the second question on interference, of course, if you take the official Russian position, no one would recognize that Russia did interfere in Europe or in the US political developments. They will say, we never did it, we do not do it, and we will never do it. So you do interfere, but we do not. So that is the official line. But if you talk to people in power in a less official format, they are likely to tell you, yes, we do interfere, but it's only to send a signal to our Western partners. It's not about our attempts to disrupt or to destroy political institutions in Europe or in the United States. It's not to support separatism in, let's say, Scotland or in Catalonia, but we just want to signal to our partners that they should stop their malign activities within the Russian Federation. So if you do not mess with our affairs, we can assure you that we will not mess with your affairs. If you live in the house of glass, don't you throw stones at the windows of your neighbors. So this is the message. You can say that there is a lot of hypocrisy in this message, but I think that this is the narrative which exists in the Russian leadership. And this is the narrative which was reflected, by the way, in the negotiations between Biden and Putin in Geneva when they started discussing cyber. Because when Biden raised this issue, Putin responded that we are also concerned about cyber attacks. We are concerned about interference. And by the way, a lot of cyber attacks against the Russian Federation can be traced back to the territory of the United States. So this is the logic, and I think that this logic will stay at least for some time in Moscow. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this, Andre. But please, remember that Spain was the only country among the few countries not recognizing Kosovo. So some people in Spain thought that it was a bit unfair that despite all the efforts not to support succession, then, we got this non-recognized interference anyway. That was just a note. So, por favor, Josep, alto representante, puedes concluir había estas dos preguntas sobre Ucrania y repúblicas bálticas, y con esto podemos terminar.
Care to answer now? Well, as regards Ukraine, the European response was using the instruments we have, that is by imposing economic sanctions against Russia. When it's funny when they say, well, you were very weak, and what would you have done is my question. So what would have been an adequate response? Starting a war with Russia, for instance? Would that be a suitable response? Well, that's obviously out of the question, because the European Union is not a military alliance. And let's say this very clearly. It is not a military alliance. The European Union is not a European NATO. We do not have the capability, nor do we want to intervene on the military front. We have instruments. Let's say that we have civilian instruments, that is financial sanctions, which are pretty significant, which really hurt, because you know that economic sanctions are very harmful, and you know that if you are sanctioned, they respond, and there are other economic sanctions that are having a cost for the countries that impose them, because whoever receives a sanction replicates. And in Spain, there are companies that have been negatively affected by the economic sanctions imposed by Russia. And this applies to other European countries too. But let's say that the capabilities that the European Union has is based on sanctioning the politicians or certain activity sectors of the affected countries. But in any case, this is, I think, what is beyond our capacity is an energetic response, that is initiating a war over the Crimea issue, for instance. And the European territorial defense is in the hands of NATO, and this is the reality, and there's no alternative as regards to the territorial defense of Europe. It has to be based on NATO, and the Ukraine is not a NATO member, and the United States doesn't want to adopt more radical measures either. So let's be very clear about this, please. Let's be sensible. And then as regards the Baltic republics, I don't know what you mean in your question about the Baltic republics. Sorry, he's asking the question without a microphone. Well, they are members of the European Union, they are members of NATO, and the Kremlin knows perfectly well what this means. Ukraine was not a member of NATO, but the Baltic republics are. And right now, there's a deployment of NATO forces in which Spain is involved in the Baltic republics. And the Baltic republics have a past that has to be understood in order to understand its position in terms of Russia. They've been military occupied. They also form part of the Soviet Union. And they have this inheritance, they have this background that is very close to their skin. I've spoken to people from the Baltic republics that have said to me, look, I was deported to Russia, to Siberia twice in my life. I've been sent there twice. And if we were to analyze, if we were to have this experience, we possibly look at Russia from a completely different perspective. And we have to understand this story. We have to understand this situation too, where there are lots of direct personal experiences involved, and which are different compared to other European countries. So this is when we discuss the relationship with Russia. They adopt that position, and they see Russia as a threat. And much more than if you were to ask the same question in Algarve, in Portugal, because things look differently from there. So when you discuss on whether a higher level conversation should be held with Russia, and you ask why Biden can hold a summit with Putin and not the Europeans, well, the answer is between Biden and Moscow, there's an Atlantic Ocean, and between us and Russia, we only have the fence of a border, which is not the same thing, of course. But anyway, I think that belonging to NATO and belonging to the European Union, in the case of the Baltic republics, is like having a very significant insurance policy against any hypothetical wish of carrying out any kind of action. It's a very hypothetical, and it's out of the radar screen, but it could happen in the relationship with Russia, of course. Okay.
Here with us today. We really hope that next year we can meet you in person, but I think as an aperitif, this has been a great discussion for what comes next year and so on. So thank you so much for being here today. Muchísimas gracias de corazón a todos. Hasta pronto, seguimos en contacto. Gracias, alto representante.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Os recuerdo que la sesión esta tarde empieza a las 3, no a las 3:30, a las 3 sobre América Latina. Gracias.